Building a sense of confidence and belief is an essential component of any child's success, both inside and outside of the classroom. This is especially true for students with disabilities. This is why, on today's episode of the Speak Up podcast, we're here today to hear from Graciela Flores Mendez, a staff lawyer from Arch Disability Law Center, surrounding the topic of an individual education plan, or an IEP for short. Today you'll hear exactly what an IEP is and why some children benefit from having them, how they are developed, and how they can change over time. My conversation with Flores Mendez starts right now. Graciela, if you're ready, I'll take a moment to welcome you to the program, and I'm super excited to dive into individual education plans with you and the benefits they have for students with disabilities. Great to see you, and thank you so very much for being here.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Now, Graciela, I'm wondering if we can start our conversation by you telling me a little bit about the rights students have who have disabilities to receive a meaningful education. What does that mean from a legal perspective in your view?
Well, just to be clear, there's students with disabilities have rights and are protected by different types of legislation. But the biggest one that we talk about is the Ontario Human Rights Code, which protects students against various types of discrimination. So discrimination looks, different, and there's different types of it, but the Human Rights Code protects students against that, also against harassment and also against reprisal, or, maybe people are more familiar with the term retaliation, than when it's connected to their disability. So, just to be clear, the code is really important because it's quasi-constitutional. So that means that it has primacy over other legislation. And in other words, if there's other laws that are inconsistent with the Human Rights Code, the Human Rights Code will prevail. So under the code, um, children, students have the right to equal treatment in education, um, without discrimination. And as that's part of the protection for equal treatment in services, education is considered a service under the Human Rights Code. And to be clear, this kind of protection applies to elementary, secondary schools, colleges, universities, and that's both public schools and private schools. And the Human Rights Code says that school boards must work to remove barriers which prevent students with disabilities from accessing education. So what this means is that it requires schools and school boards to provide what are called accommodations for students with disabilities. And accommodations are essentially supports that a student needs to get an education equal to that of their peers. So an accommodation seeks to even the playing field for students with disabilities, and the appropriate accommodation depends on the individual needs of the child. So the school and the school board have a duty, an obligation, a legal obligation to provide accommodation up to the point of undue hardship. So those are some of the rights that students have at school, in schools.
Yeah, absolutely. And Graciela, let's specifically talk about IEPs or individual education plans and exactly what they are and what you think parents need to know.
Yeah. So an IEP, like you said, is an individual education plan, and it's a plan for education for students with disabilities that's created under the Education Act. So I mentioned previously that the Human Rights Code is the big human rights law, but there's other also laws that apply, the Education Act being one of them. And under the Education Act, an IEP has specific requirements. It's a plan essentially to figure out how to best educate a student, and this should be written in collaboration between the school, the child, the parents, and with recommendations from health service providers like health providers. The IEP sets out a student's learning expectations and any accommodations that they may need to get a meaningful education. So as I pointed out earlier, an accommodation is just, some what the needs that the child would need. Um, and so the IEP can be looked at as a document that is essentially an accommodation plan. And that's similar to what we see in the education context, right? Like if you have a job and you need an accommodation, there's usually something in writing that outlines, what your needs are and what is being agreed to be provided to you. It serves as that written record of the accommodations that the school should be providing a student. And for parents, it's important to understand that while an IEP can be created after what is called an identification, placement, and review committee meeting, um, that usually happens to identify students with disabilities and to provide them with a placement. An IPRC is not necessary to create an IEP. And also, an IEP is not even necessary for a child to receive disability related accommodations, but it is an important tool that is used to make the accommodation process easier, more transparent for all of the parties, and it's a written record.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Graciela, if a parent believes that their child could benefit from the formation of an IEP, what sort of questions do you think they should ask themselves?
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think that first of all, if the child is old enough, the first step for the parents should be to communicate with that child about what they think they need to succeed, how barriers present themselves at school, and whether they have ideas that would help them. So a lot of the time, I see that decisions are being made without the input of the person that is at the center of those decisions, and that's the child. Obviously, if they're old enough. It's also really important for the parent to communicate with other health professionals and service providers that may be part of, this child's team about specific concerns if a child is struggling with school. Because the determination about what exactly a child may need in schools is often based on medical documentation. So if members of this care team have recommendations about how to support the child, this information is really important. Parents should also reach out to the child's teachers for their observations about the child's challenges at school. And finally, if a parent does not know much about their child's rights as a person with a disability, they should consider seeking legal advice.
Yeah, absolutely. And Graciela, as you mentioned earlier, an IUP is really a customized a document to meet the needs of individual students and really making sure they have a chance to succeed in the classroom. And I'm wondering if you could expand just a little bit on the importance of having a collaborative approach between the parents and teachers and other professionals that are involved in the students' education. I'm wondering if you can emphasize why it's important to have that collaborative approach.
Yeah, well, collaboration is really important because each of the groups has different insight, right? They have different resources and obligations to support the student in their education. So, in my experience, IEPs are often badly drafted and horribly implemented, especially when there's no input from the child or their parents or any of like other health providers or a support team. So an IEP is supposed to be tailored to the needs of every individual child. So a generic template may meet the requirements under the Education Act, but it will actually do very little to actually support the child in an effective manner. So I speak to a lot of parents who don't even understand what the IEP is or what the contents are or how to raise issues about the IEP with other school staff. And if the adults don't know, the children know less. So simply, it's kind of like if it takes a village, to raise a child, the village can't really function if everybody within it doesn't understand and agree and works towards the common goal. So collaboration is really important between all of the parties.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm wondering if we could transition our conversation to telling me how the success of the IEP is measured and how parents and educators can determine if it's helping to guide programming and the appropriate accommodations to help students succeed in the classroom. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, this is actually a really difficult question because for example, it is really helpful when the IEP includes those goals and objectives that, you want to meet and has as part of it measurable steps to get those objectives, right? So like very big, broad, general goals sometimes are not very helpful because, what are the little steps to get there? Is it even measurable? So obviously meeting those goals if they are put in the IEP, that would help measure whether there's success or not. But it also depends. Some parents would say that success is, I see the grades of my child improving. Some parents would say success is I have a child that now knows that they can be supported enough in school that they can make it through a whole day, right? It really depends. I think success depends on the circumstances. So I would personally say that the greatest measurement of whether an IEP is successful or not is how supported and how destigmatized the child feels at school. So, can the child focus on being a student in the same ways that other children without disabilities can? So, when I hear a lot from them, it's just like they just want to go to school. They want to feel safe. They don't want to feel attacked, right? They want to worry about the same things that other students are worrying about instead about, are my accommodations being met? Am I getting the support that I need? And so, for children that are too young or who struggle with communication due to their disability, what are the observations that can be made by the parents and the teachers? An IEP is not a fix it, it doesn't fix it all. And there's no guarantee that the first IEP that is drafted will address all of the child's needs. That is why it's very important that the IEP is viewed as like a living and changeable document. A child's needs will change throughout the child's life. And so parents and educators need to allow for that flexibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And Graciela, as you just mentioned in your previous remark, an IUP can really assist in the
Yeah.
academic performance and confidence of students with disabilities, both in and outside of the classroom. And what are your thoughts on accommodations through an IEP and how they can help a child reach their fullest potential and really enhance their academic performance and confidence in and outside of the classroom?
Yeah. So an IEP is a plan, right? Like I said, that outlines how a student will achieve education according to their needs. And by creating this clear record of accommodations, for example, and if the IEP is implemented in the way that is agreed, this can really help even that playing field for academic performance for sure. I get a lot of calls, for example, about kids, especially those with invisible disabilities such as autism or ADHD, who have been labeled as disruptive or problematic or simply that they're bad kids, they're bad students. due to the disability related behavior and how it manifests. So a lot of adults in the education system seem not to hesitate at all to make their negative opinions of these children known. And whether or not they actually say it out loud or outright, kids understand it and they internalize it, right? So they begin believing that they are inherently bad or stupid or that they are the problem. And they think, well, what's the point of trying or following the IEP? So why not just give up, right? And so there's often a cycle that keeps repeating itself, in this process. So the IEP is either really badly made or it's not implemented correctly. The kid is not accommodated appropriately as a result. Disability related behaviors are made worse by the lack of accommodation. Then an incident happens and the kid is punished for the behavior. So usually after that, there's some sort of meeting about the IEP without actual like discussion about how to fix it, and the cycle begins again. And so a lot of the problem is that even when the student is old enough, they're excluded from the accommodation process. Teachers and administrators and parents don't seek to involve. So often kids know that there's an accommodation plan in place, an IEP in place, but they have no idea what it contains. And nobody has explained to them why it exists or what it says or what the objectives are. And so I think whenever possible, students should be involved in their education. They should have a copy, in my opinion, of their IEP that they can access and look at and read through. And so the best way to ensure that they have confidence in and outside the classroom, provide them with knowledge and understanding of their rights, the roles and obligations of all of the parties, including their own, and also empowering them to communicate when something is not working so that those changes can be made to the IEP instead of waiting for that incident to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Graciela, I'm curious to ask you about how often an IEP should be reviewed and the types of accommodations that may have to be adjusted as a child's needs changes. What are your thoughts there?
An IEP should be reviewed as needed, and that depends again on the individual needs of the child. Generally, though, the IEP should be reviewed at least once every school year. But if it needs to be reviewed or edited more often, it should be. Don't do that. Review the documents. And so usually that review happens once a year uh, for the school year. And it's important to do that because the accommodations and goals that are appropriate in an IEP really do depend on every individual kid throughout time. You and I, for example, may have the disability and the same diagnosis, but our needs are going to be completely different. And that's why it's important, as I mentioned previously, that, seek recommendations from health professionals and other people that may understand what the child needs. Talk to your kid and ask them what they need. What would help them learn better? Help them demystify their disabilities so that they understand that there are a lot of us with disabilities that can be successful in school.
Absolutely. And Ella, tell me if people or parents or students feel that they need to advocate for changes to an IEP. What sort of options do you think they have, and what direction would you point them in that regard?
Sure. So if a parent is unhappy with an IEP, I guess the first question is, what is exactly the issue? What do you have a problem? Is it that the IEP does not accurately reflect your kid's needs? Or is it that it's really well written, but they're actually not implementing it correctly? Um, the first person, like I've been mentioning throughout this whole conversation, to speak to if a parent is not happening is, first the child, but also the classroom teacher. They have that one-on-one relationship with the child. If that doesn't work, then go to the principal. Let them know your concerns and try to identify what the issue is. If possible, from a legal perspective, I would advise people to communicate with them in writing and track how they respond to your concerns. If you can ask for a meeting to discuss the IEP if that's necessary. If a meeting is scheduled, ask, beforehand for a copy of the agenda, ask for how long the meeting will be and who will be present. Because I cannot tell you how many times parents are just shocked. They thought they were going in for a meeting to talk about one thing and the meeting goes completely a different way. And if you do attend that meeting, take a support person with you. They can, help you not only with their presence, but also they can take notes. Go into that meeting with questions, be prepared, and have specific examples of what you think the issue is. If you think that another accommodation is needed, something needs to be added. So it also is very helpful to speak to your child's health about your concerns. Education providers do have that duty to accommodate uh, and to provide accommodations that address a child's needs related to their disability. So this means they don't have to accommodate your preferences as a parent, and they don't have to accommodate for the preferences of your child. They have an obligation to accommodate the child's needs. So having that medical documentation to support your request is really important, especially in circumstances where you're getting pushback from the school. Also, if you need legal advice, get some. So, ARCH, the organization that I'm a part of, Arch Disability Law Center, is available to offer free summer legal advice. You can also reach out to organizations like the Human Rights Legal Support Center or Pro Bono Ontario for legal advice. And I would say if you need more information just to understand what an IEP is, you can look through our website, Arch's website. You can look at your school board's special education plan. So just so everybody knows, every school board is mandated by the Ministry of Education to come up with what they call a special education plan that outlines, what services they provide children with special needs, and they have to publish that every year. So that is a good place sometimes to start, and they will have a section on what the IEP is and how it looks like for their specific school board. You can also, if you want like a more general overview of what an IEP is and what it should have in it, to see if the ministry, if they're following ministry guidelines, you can look at the Ministry of Education Special Education in Ontario Kindergarten to Grade 12 Policy and Resource Guide. You can just Google it and you'll find it. And those are good resources to look at. Yeah, so usually every school year, if there's already an IEP in place, there will be a review, like a yearly review of the IEP. And sometimes the school will like send home a form or something like that that allows you to either, bring up issues or reevaluate or discuss the IEP or just waive that and just say, oh no, we don't need to do that. It's the same as it was last year, right? So I would encourage parents to actually have those discussions, especially if your kids' needs have changed from last year, right? Because again, knowledge is power. So it's good to remind yourself and your kid what is actually in the IEP for any given school year.
Yeah, absolutely. And Graciela, I want to thank you for joining me today to have this important discussion about the importance of individual education plans, parents and students' rights, and why it's important to advocate for this reason. And I want to thank Arts Disability Law Center and you personally for engaging in conversation and having this important conversation. So I want to thank you for your time and for being here this afternoon. It's most appreciated.
No, it's been my pleasure. Again, if people need further advice at any point, it's always better to get that legal advice as soon as possible. And our is here if you need any help.